Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Issues of the Heart podcast. I'm your host, Brother Kobe.
And I'm Rogers. Today we're talking about the issue that you've seen in the news the last couple of days that has generated a lot of concern, questions, speculation, etc. What topic is that? That's the topic of Roe v. Wade and the question of will abortion rights be forever altered in America? As you know, the question in terms of abortion rights is one that has never been presented in terms of legislation. So there's no legislation that has gone before Congress, or at least I should say that has passed Congress that has become law. And so there are a number of different laws that have been written by states, et cetera. So as we look at it today, we're going to look through a couple of lenses. One, we want to look to find out the historical reasons behind the Roe v. Wade decision, why it became important. Secondly, we're also going to talk about the impetus, what took place within the religious community to be able to shift the focus and the attention from one of a pro-choice to one of a pro-life position. And thirdly, we want to talk briefly and to find out if there is any implications in terms of the current political climate as relates to abortion in respect to prophetic fulfillments of Revelation 13, et cetera. So first, I'm going to take a quick stab and overview of the Roe v. Wade background. So in 1973, the Supreme Court on January the 22nd issued a verdict in the Roe versus Wade. It was a 7-2 majority decision that was in favor of Roe. Now, Roe is not an actual person. Roe is it's like a pseudonym, as we would call a John Doe. But it was a law that was brought, a law that challenged the standing statutes that were in Texas. And so the patient wanted to be able to have an abortion. So she was unwed. This was going to be her third child, and she was not able to get an abortion under existing Texas law. So Norma McCorvey was contacted by an attorney and asked if her case could be used to be able to challenge the laws that were in Texas. So again, she was not able to get an abortion. At that particular time, it was a criminal offense. So her case was brought before the judiciary in Texas, and Wade was not her husband. Wade was not her boyfriend. As I mentioned, she was unmarried, but Wade was the Texas district attorney. So it became known as Roe v. Wade. In essence, what the background for the law was not an issue in terms of murder or a medical procedure and so forth, as people would so term it. It really became an issue in terms of constitutionality. And the plaintiff, in this case, Roe, challenged the validity of the law that prohibited abortion based off of a couple of different precepts. Number one was the First Amendment, then the Fourth, Fifth, Ninth, and the 14th Amendments. In a nutshell, what these amendments are designed to do is to be able to protect a person's individual rights, the right to privacy, the right for government to not be far-reaching, the right to due process, et cetera. This created a particular challenge and dilemma because at this time in American history, women did not have the right to be able to make decisions on their own. In fact, even in the 70s, a woman could not say that she wanted even her tubes tied. Maybe she was a wife and she didn't want any more kids. Well, she was not able to get the procedure done to tie her tubes. In fact, even some of the things in terms of contraception we should talk about, whether it was birth control, whether it was a pill, whether it was getting your tubes tied, et cetera, even within the scope of the Catholic Church, any type of contraception is viewed as being unacceptable. So again, that goes from a pill, goes from birth control, coitus interruptus as it's called, withdrawal or condoms, any of those things, pills, they are not accepted because creation or procreation in the context of marriage is viewed as being sacred. And so if you do anything to interfere with the ability to be able to become pregnant, this is looked at as being a cardinal sin, I should say. As a result of this background, then you can understand some of the complexity of the situation that the woman was not able to have any say-so in terms of her own body, reproductive rights, and to go further in the teachings of the church. If a person is raped if a person is pregnant by incest, if the life of the child is in danger, if the life of the mother is in danger, if the mother is psychologically unfit to be able to have a child, none of those are acceptable reasons to be able to have a medically induced abortion. So in short, a person could be assaulted, they could be raped, and the child is not responsible for the rape. Certainly that is true, we understand that. But most would say that it would be okay or acceptable for a woman to be able to have an abortion. Well, the church said, no, that's just wrong, et cetera. So Roe was challenging the notion, pushing this forward, that a woman had a right to be able to decide what would happen to her body within her own determination, consultation with her doctors, and so forth. So the courts took up the decision. In fact, in the process that took place in Texas, she actually won the case there, but the district court refused to put an injunction in place to prohibit or to eliminate the possibility of, or to allow the possibility of other women to be able to get abortions. The case finally made its way to the Supreme Court. And so again, in 1973, January the 22nd, the court essentially ruled in favor. And what they did when they ruled in favor is there were a couple of pieces that were as a part of the ruling. In short, they took the pregnancy and split it into 3 trimesters. The first part being the first trimester, in which abortion on demand without interference from the state. And so this became vital because they did not look at a baby as being viable outside of the womb in the first trimester. And so to many, it became then as a fetus or tissue or cell. So again, we're talking about a baby, we understand this, but they viewed it in the context of 3 distinct trimesters. So in the first trimester, if you wanted an abortion on demand, meaning you did not have to have one of those reasons as I listed. Some states, again, did not allow reasons for rape, did not allow for incest, mental state, etc. It was completely and explicitly outlawed. So as a result, you had a number of women who would have alley abortions, as we're called, to go to people who are not licensed and so forth in different ways. And not every situation you talk of abortion was from the context of someone being promiscuous, someone committing fornication, a teenager getting pregnant. Certainly sometimes those were cases, but even in the context of marriage, you had sometimes maybe a wife didn't want to have another child. Maybe the husband did. Maybe the husband didn't want to have a child. Maybe the wife did. Essentially, a woman had not the ability to be able to say what would take place with her body. Now, that would be strange for us because we have grown up mostly in a society that affords those freedoms, but it would be the same as a male going to the doctor and the doctor discussing a procedure and the male or husband having to say, well, let me go get my wife to sign off on that. Before I get this vasectomy, let me see if my wife will sign the papers for it. And maybe he wants it, but she doesn't. Maybe he wants to get some type of procedure done to maybe be able to treat impotence or something. And before he can get it done, his wife needs to come in and sign off. Well, people will be in alarm for that. They'll say, well, no, we're not going to do that. That's not fair. All I'm doing is just painting the picture of the situation from the perspective of a male versus a female. So when the court ruled this, again, the first trimester, you simply could get an abortion on demand. So the state would not interfere with that. In the second trimester, the state could regulate abortion for safety, but could not prohibit them entirely. And then we move into the third trimester, where the state could regulate or forbid all abortions except to save the life of the mother. And so this became the framework of legislation. I shouldn't say legislation, but became the framework, if you please, the law of the land for essentially the next 50 years. We're not quite at 50 years, 2023. January 22nd will be a 50-year window. We're at 49 years. And as a result of that, there's been much outcry that people in the public have protested on both sides, pro-choice, pro-life. People have sought to push it further to say, well, when does life begin? Does it begin at the inception, the first time the sperm and the egg unite? Is that considered life, or is it a little bit further on? And so people are still trying to figure out, well, exactly when does it happen? And then you enter into the equation of the notion, then, well, when is life viable? At what particular point is life viable? And we know that there are studies that would let us know, well, at this particular age, you're able to determine a heartbeat, you can be able to see internal organs, et cetera. But that became a catalyst. And so now today, you have a lot of people who are discussing now the rights of the unborn, and to state it as such, that this is the time again when the child is conceived. And so again, it brings up a host of other questions that may be dealt with in a scientific realm and so forth. But that was what Roe v. Wade was. Now, I would submit to you that in the challenge of it, the opportunity of it being challenged, and there's always been a push for it. Every time there's a presidential election, there are those that are on the right have insisted that we make sure that a Republican is in office, because if there's a chance to appoint a Supreme Court justice that will sit until they die or retire, we want one that has conservative values that will overturn Roe v. Wade. And then, of course, in the same election, Democrats, we want to make sure that we get someone in office who is going to be sympathetic to women's rights. who understand that a doctor doesn't have the say so over the rights of a body, or the government does not have that far reaching authority. And we then want to make sure that a person will be in office that will be sympathetic to the cause of women's rights, women's health issues, women's reproductive issues, and so forth. And so you can see then that the framework is fraught with a lot of potential peril and pitfalls, because as judges and legislators and so forth, they're not called upon to sit in respect of a scriptural basis. They're called upon to interpret law, or to interpret law as it has been written, what's written there. And so there are a lot of things that we may not personally agree to and ascribe to. But when the context of the law was simply looked at as deciding, well, what does the law say and how do we apply it? So for instance, if there were a court case that you were called upon to be a juror on, you have to judge it based off of the merits of the law, not based off of what your personal opinion is, not even based off what your religious opinions are. Your upbringing is based on the merits of the law, what was presented and so forth. So you might hold the view to feel that that maybe a person should never have a gun, and you're called upon in a case to be able to decide the fate of someone who was involved in a situation with the gun. Well, you can't go in and say, well, I don't believe people should have a gun, therefore the person is innocent or guilty. It doesn't fly. It's what is the law? What's written in the law? How do these actions come into conflict, or how do they align with what is attested to in the law? And therein make a decision. And so simply, that's what the judges are doing on the Supreme Court. They are looking at the law and being able to look at the situation, looking at precedent, what has happened before, et cetera, what's gone into case law, and making a determination or a ruling based off of those particular factors. So in the coming days, then we would expect to find out what will happen. We don't know if this will be overturned, if it will stay as it is, but certainly this will not be the last time that one hears about it. But that's the background of what's taking place right now. But to get a better picture of it, we're going to go a step further to find out, well, how did it all come to place? Because now, again, you have churches, some will say that, hey, especially in the evangelical circle, that it is adamantly pro-life, that there are no exceptions. It's pro-life, maybe not as stringent in terms of the contraception method. And so in general, some people in the in society, they look and say, well, hold it, if we go by these rules, then you're not gonna give us any birth control pills. We can't get an IUD. We can't get any forms of contraception. Even if there is a pregnancy, there's no opportunity for an abortion. Then basically you're saying that if you have sex, then you get pregnant, you're just gonna deal with it. So I'm not advocating, we're not advocating a particular position at this point, but that is the background of what people are looking at in this totality. So make no mistake about it. When this is unraveled, it will open up a lot in terms of what are states' rights, what far reach should the government have, if any. And these are some questions, again, to be considered, especially I find it interesting because you have so many people who are like, well, the state should have no influence, the state should have no say so. When we talk about the vaccine, they're like, well, the state can't say you should take a vaccine and so forth. Well, keep that same energy then when you talk about this particular topic that we're discussing, because one ties into the other. You have to be able to look, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And so you say then, well, no, the state can't say that you have to do this, but then the state can't say that you have to do that. Different things to consider. But that said, that's a background of Roe v. Wade. Now we're taking a step further in terms of the history. How did the church community get to where it is today?
Yeah, one of the things, just coming into the church at the time I did, I've only known the church to take one stance on it. And, I had to go back and do some history, to do some digging, to get an understanding, because now, for the evangelicals, this is like the mark of the beast issue for them. This is their testing truth for a lot of the evangelical community. And it holds, there's a political aspect of it as well. I remember when Joe Biden was elected as president, you had this so-called prophet that gave this big prophecy, and he made this big deal about abortion, and God was going to judge the nation on the abortion issue. Let's let's ignore all the social injustices that's out there. God's not going to judge America for this, but God's going to judge America for its stance on abortion, for allowing abortions. And I know people have taken the stance. We quote 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19 to 20. What? Know you not that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, which is in you, which you have of God. You are not your own. You are bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body and in your spirits, which are the Lord's. And so, because you have the whole, my body, my choice, my body, my decision. So you can't make me make a decision about my body. It's a chant. And so others would throw out there, well, wait a minute, your body is not yours. You don't belong to you. You're God's purchased possession. So you can't say my body, my choice. You must go by what the will of God is. And then, we have the whole Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, that before you were born, before I knew you before you were born, before you were formed in the belly, I had a plan for you. And so with the whole abortion issue, it's like you're killing future doctors, future lawyers, future presidents, future all of these great things. And so God has a plan for these children. And when you kill these children, you're killing the plan of God. Now, what I want to do is I want to look at some other scriptures that's in the Bible that would seem to kind of throw some balance to the whole issue. However, like I said before, looking back at it, the church didn't always take this staunch stance like it has to be black and white. There's no wiggle room. There's no compromise on the issue. And so I want to just briefly go over a little bit of the history of why the church, the evangelicals, and specifically took this hard stance. I want to read something that was stated by the church in the early 1900s, the mid 1900s, the stance that all the churches took. This says, I'm going to read this paragraph. It says, in 1968, for instance, a symposium sponsored by the Christian Medical Society and Christianity Today, the flagship magazine of evangelicalism, refused to characterize abortion as sinful, citing individual health, family welfare, and social responsibility as justifications for ending pregnancy. So there was three things right there that they justified abortion. Number one, individual health, meaning of the mother, the family welfare, because you provide or take care of this child, and social responsibility. It says in 1971, delegates to the Southern Baptist Convention in St. Louis, Missouri, passed a resolution encouraging Southern Baptists to work for legislation that will allow the possibility of abortion under such conditions as rape, incest, clear evidence of severe fetal deformity, and carefully ascertained evidence of the likelihood of damage to the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother. The convention, hardly a redoubt of liberal values, reaffirmed that position in 1974, 1 year after Roe, and again in 1976. So we see, wait a minute, there's something wrong with this, because the Christian community had not always taken the stance of no abortion under any circumstance. We saw that there were certain circumstances where they said abortion could be right. And they even went to the government that said, yes, you ought to have abortion for certain circumstances, make it legal. Now, this is the stance that the church took. And we have to ask ourselves, well, wait a minute, what changed from then to now? And that's a whole history I can go into, but we don't have that type of time to go into all that history. I think I'll post a link to this article because it goes over all of that history. But one of the things that it talks about is they used abortion as a Trojan horse politically because they were upset about something else. There was this situation that took place. I don't know if anybody knows the situation between Brown versus the Board of Education. And basically what that was, it told all the schools that you have to desegregate. You have to allow your schools to allow minorities to enter into it. Now, one of the things about it, all right, that's cool for public schools. And so a lot of these Christian denominations had their private Christian schools that was receiving government funding. And so the government told them, since you're receiving funding from us, you also have to abide by this Brown versus Board of Education. You have to allow blacks to enter into your school. And there were certain, you know, pastors or, you know, Christian churches that wasn't trying to go for that. And so they couldn't go or lead out under the auspices of, hey, we don't want, you know, blacks in our schools, because who's going to ride for that cause, right? And so they couldn't allow that to be their Trojan horse. So they jumped on the bandwagon of, and I think it was Johnson who was the president at the time. And so they wanted to vote, get rid of him, and they needed a president and a group. That's where you had the religious right came in. And they had this block of individuals where they said, all right, this is the issue that we're going to push forward. This is going to be the front man, you know, and but we really, you know, this underlying issue that was there. And so they were going to use abortion to lead out. And that's where President Reagan came in. And when we look at this, this is where the church's stance changed on abortion, because now as they're using this as their Trojan horse, they can't say, well, under certain conditions, we will allow abortions. And this is where we find ourselves today. And the church has not always taken that stance of, you know, no abortions under any circumstance. Now, for me personally, I just must say, you know, if somebody came to me and, you know, depending on the circumstances, you know, I would, no matter what the circumstances is, I will always tell them, hey, you need to pray about this situation. It's a serious situation. But there are certain situations where I can understand some of the ones listed here, because I know a young lady that I talked to before, and, you know, she had certain health complications, and the doctor told her that if you have another child, you know, he told her to stop getting pregnant, because he said your life could be in danger. If you have this child, you can lose your life trying to give birth to this next child coming forward. And so I looked at her like, I don't know if you want to take that risk, you know, you or the child, you know. And so if you're in that situation, and there's been these type of situations where complications can get so, and we have that in the Bible. Remember Benjamin, when he was born, Rachel gave birth to Benjamin, and in the process of her giving birth to Benjamin, she wound up dying. And so you have these real life situations where to give birth might cost the life of the mother. So you have to make a decision. Are we going to abort the child and save the mother, or are we going to allow the mother to die to save the child? And so there's not a clear cut Bible decision on that, in that situation. There's not a moral issue to where we can say, no, this is what we ought to do versus this one. These are situations that you must pray about it. So if someone is just out there, they're just fornicating and they're being irresponsible, they get pregnant and they say, well, I don't want to have the child because it's going to interrupt my life. I'm not going to encourage that person to go get an abortion. But, you know, in a situation where if a woman is raped or there's some severe situation and it was brought to me, I would, you know, tell that person to pray, but I will understand that person going forward to get an abortion. And what you have to understand is this: what about if it's your daughter that got raped? And I understand, you know, you have all these propaganda videos that are out where you have individuals coming forward. Well, my mother was raped and she had me. I'm glad she had me because I'm able to live such and such a life. And fine, of course, you're glad you're alive. You're glad your mother didn't abort you. But all situations are not the same. You see, and so I can understand someone wanting to go down that route. As a matter of fact, reading a few scriptures. Let's try this one because we're familiar with the ones I've already quoted, but how about this one? How about Hosea chapter 9, verse 14, which says, give them, O Lord, what will you give? Give them a miscarrying womb and dry breast. A miscarrying womb. Now, the interesting thing about it is, at that time, in those days, you know, you know, God said, be fruitful and multiply. For people to be able to give birth was seen as a blessing. For women to have you know, have these miscarriages, that means that the woman is pregnant and she carries the child for a certain amount of time, but she's not able to bring forth to the birth at some time previous to that, the child would, perish in the womb and she's not able to give birth. That was seen as a punishment for, the people at that time. This is under the curse per se. And I don't want women to think just because they had a miscarriage, God is punishing them, that there's some type of judgment from God. These type of things happen, as we will see from certain Bible texts. But this was a thing where God was saying, well, how are you going to punish these particular people at this time? We said, hey, miscarrying womb, dry breast. So does Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5 apply under this circumstance? All these miscarrying wombs, did God know them beforehand? Did God have a plan for him for these child before they were formed in the womb? You see? And so what about all of those children? Did God have a plan for them? Were those future doctors, lawyers, and so forth? What about this? Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 2 and 3. It says, I envy those who are dead and gone. They are better off than those who are still alive. So he said the dead are better than those who are still living. Then he says, but better off than either of those who have never been born, who have never seen the injustice that goes on in the world. So what he's saying here, a dead person that has lived and died is better than those who are still living. But better than both of them is the stillborn, the child that never made it to see the light of day. His existence is better than the both of those. Now, what do we do with these scriptures? What do we do with these texts? Did not God have a plan for them? And of course, these are not situations where the mother purposely went to abort the child, but something happened during the pregnancy that she was not able to bring forth. But here, under inspiration, Solomon is saying that stillborn child is better than those who are living and those who have lived and have died. How about this? Ecclesiastes chapter 6 and verse 3. Some people may have 100 children and live a long life, but no matter how long they live, if they aren't content with life's good things, I say that even a stillborn child with no grave is better off than they. And so these are some of the scriptures that are here. So in contrast to what scriptures people normally use, and you look at these, there is no clear justification or condemnation on either side. I believe this is an issue that one must seriously pray on and seek counsel of the Lord. I don't think we can be so dogmatic about this particular thing. And so I definitely don't think it's something that should be legislated through the courts. Now I'm gonna pass it back to you because I know you have something to say.
Sure. So let's just recap real quick. So we talked about, from the perspective of scripture, inspiration, there's no clear mandate or condemnation, affirmation or condemnation one way or another. That ultimately we're dealing with an area of personal choice. And with that area of personal choice, still our counsel is, and I think the context of the scripture is, hey, life is precious. Just to go into say, I'm going to end life because I was just messing around and I'm not ready to be a mom or be a parent and so forth. We're not condoning that. What we are saying is that there are justifiable reasons whereby a medically induced abortion may be necessary, i.e. we've talked about it. It could be rape, it could be incest, mental stability, health for the baby, health for the mom, etc. Those are real situations. And we don't live in a perfect world, unfortunately, because of sin. And I know that there's some people like, well, hey, just pray and God will work it out. And, we pray and know that God gives us the ultimate decision. He gives us the choice to make, like in the case that you shared of the young lady with the child, or I don't know if she had a child or just was told, hey, if you get pregnant. But I do know of a situation of a woman who was pregnant and the baby was developing outside of the womb. And the doctor said, listen, we have to do something because either the child is going to die or you're going to die, or both you're going to die. In that particular case, the mom didn't have to make a decision because the child ended up miscarrying. But you have those situations. And again, it's not, we don't live in this perfect world. We live where people are victimized, where women are taken advantage of and so forth. So we want to be clear in the position there. But again, that's a choice and decision that this person has to make. And while we may have our own views and so forth, I mean, you look at something in terms of maybe being an atheist, being maybe a worshiper of the Church of Satan. This is, again, an extreme position and so forth. Do I support that? No, but does a person have a right to? Yes. Would I even be willing to sign to say they have a right to it? Yeah, I would, because that is, again, freedom from religion also means, or freedom of religion also means freedom from religion. You don't have to think the way that I think. But when we're not going to legislate morality based off of our conviction as such, but we want to make sure, though, that in that context, that there are going to certainly be some choices, and it becomes very difficult, but it becomes some very difficult choices that you have to make sometimes, and that being the price of freedom. Again, I may not agree with that. I may not, certainly would not endorse certain types of religious practices. Now, if you're talking about a practice and your religion is that you're going to marry multiple women, you're going to have incestuous relationships, you're going to take kids and marry them. No, that's totally different. But if you're like, okay, in your religious views, then you want to eat whatever you want to worship a podium. Okay, well, I'm not going to say let's pass a law so you can't worship the podium. Knock yourself out. I'm not going to do it, but I'm not going to stop you from doing it. Those are different parameters that are there. The whole issue that we can see unfolding, in short, is that the big push now is not really because of a moral issue. But as you talked about, this goes, unfortunately, back to a system of segregation. It goes back to a racist mentality and so forth, but it's just being morphed over into something different. So lastly, in the last 30 seconds, we'll say that this does not tie into Revelation chapter 13, because I know that there's some people who want to make this a religious confrontation as such and to tie it into Revelation chapter 13. Point well taken, though, that there are so many other things that we could look at if you want to make it into a religious confrontation. But Revelation 13 isn't talking about abortion. It's talking about this implementation in terms of worship, enforcing it. So what we see happening in terms of the courts and what may happen and may not, we don't know. I would say to you that if nothing happens, then that's fine. Again, there's no religious or prophetic implication. So let's not make it into something that it is not. It is simply, again, one of those events that we see transpiring that people are going to debate and decide. Chances are, if it is overturned, then you'll have a push that will take place, and this will make the election very, very interesting coming up in November, the midterms, and then the following 2 years out, who will be able to win. And various states simply what happen is various states will have laws. So you'll have those laws that some liberal states, if you want to call them that, will be able to give rights for abortion. Some conservative states will not be able to do it. Now, one interesting thing is, and we won't talk about it, is I am seeing that many of these quote conservative states and persons that are really trying to bring America back to God are trying to carry back 50 years, not just in terms of reproductive rights, but in terms of equality, voting rights, things that deal with those of different minority groups and so forth. So it is interesting to be able to consider and to look at as to the push that is there, sort of a foment and an idea that we are going to save this country. And in their opinion, saving the country means going back to what they view as being complete, being pure, and being pristine. And that is unfortunately a biased version of Christianity where, in short, white is right and black is wrong. So if you're white, you're right. If you're black, get back. That creates certain issues and so forth. And so we'll talk about that certainly I know in the coming weeks. But again, take a look. You can read about it, you can learn about it, and so forth. But a narrow-minded view will certainly bring disasters. So we'll see what happens over the coming weeks. Certainly continue to pray for our country, pray for those that are in positions of leadership and authority. And as we pray, we recognize again that it's not an easy situation, because you're literally talking of 535 people making laws that impact nearly 300 million people, 9 people interpreting laws that impact 300 million people. So it's certainly not an easy position to be in, but in making decisions, again, we're not using per se our own personal religious views to be able to make those decisions, but you're making decisions based off of the interpretation of the law and then the application of the law, of those things being put into place. And sometimes those are difficult choices and decisions to make, but it gives us a different perspective and one to consider. But our time is up. We want to thank you again for, unless you had something to say, did you want to get good? We thank you again for tuning in and remind you to keep your heart with all diligence, because out of it are the issues of life.